My name, yes, my name is SHEN Wei. I'm based on the Institute of International and Comparative Education. My research area is global governance and policy mobility in education. I'm also very interested in the teacher professional development, so I'm looking forward to today's dialogue. First of all, please allow me to take a few minutes to introduce our activity and gestures. The Global Education Deans Forum was jointly initiated by the East China Normal University and the University of Kansas in 2018. On this framework, the GEDF Dean's vision of shared education futures dialogue series was developed in 2022 to strengthen the community among the members of the GEDF. So today it is our honor to have three guests to join this dialogue. They are Professor Viv Ellis, Dean of the Faculty of Education of Monash University, and Dr. Jenny Dean and Ms. Natalie Downes from Faculty of Education, the University of Canberra. Now let's welcome Professor Ellis give his named Beyond Education, the role of Faculties of Education in reshaping national, social, cultural, and political economical arrangements.
Thank you.
Please, Professor Ellis, you will have 30 to 40 minutes to present your research.
That's great. Thank you. Let me just share my screen, if I may. And I am going to move that. Check that. Go back a little. Okay, can you see my slides there?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great. Okay, thank you very much. Let me just take that back. Oh no, sorry. You'd think, I think Natalie said earlier, you'd think I'd be used to Zoom by now and sharing my screen, but there you go. Right, back we go. So thank you very much for the invitation. I've been aware of the Global Education Dean series for a while, and it's an honor to be invited to talk today. As I said to my colleagues just before we began, this is not going to be a traditional research presentation in terms of giving you a standard research paper. It is more of a talk. The title of the series is Shared Visions, and I wouldn't say that what I'm going to talk through is a vision that necessarily we all share, or even a vision that I've had. They always sound like something magical or religious, but it's thinking. This is my thinking based on my experience of the last 4.5 years as Dean here at Monash University in Melbourne, Australia, 27 years in higher education, working in universities in England, in Norway, and in the United States. And prior to that, 10 years as a school teacher. So that's, if you like, where I'm coming from. And where I'm coming from today is Melbourne in Australia, which is on land that is traditionally owned by the Bunurong people. These are Indigenous people in Australia. They're part of the Kulin Nation, which is an Indigenous group. And it is very important in Australia that we, all of us in Australia, particularly settlers, migrants like myself, acknowledge the fact that we're speaking on land that was taken and was unceded through colonization. And as part of the process of acknowledging country, we also pay our respects to the elders of the Bunurong people, the Kulin Nation, past, present, and we also think about their future of Indigenous people in Australia and enhancing their leadership. And I think that's a very important thing for us to do, but also it is, if you like, a sub-theme in what I'm going to be talking about today. So the title is Beyond Education, I don't mean that in a sense of we're past education, we should do something else. But I did want to talk about what I think is the broader role of faculties of education. So in different parts of the world, they're called different things. So they might be in the US colleges of education, they might be schools of education, they might be departments of education, but I'm going to just refer to faculties of education. And I'm going to talk about the role of us, the faculties or schools or departments, in reshaping things that are beyond educational, purely educational ideas alone, national, social, cultural, and economic arrangements. And of course, in saying that, I do recognize that in different parts of the world, in different languages, education can also mean more than how we understand education in the English language and in parts of the world that speak English as a first language, which tends to be much more about learning and cognitive development than it does broader development. If you go to Northern Europe, education has a slightly different, broader kind of social meaning. But I think you get my point about, I'm talking about beyond the things that we sometimes consider as our core priorities. And the plan for today then is I'm going to focus on teacher education as a field in terms of practice, research, and policy. This is, of course, an area, a field that we work in very strongly in faculties of education. For most, I would venture, I haven't done a study to confirm that, but for most colleges, schools, faculties of education in the world, teacher education is probably their core business. Here at Monash University, with about 6,000 students in the Faculty of Education, about 3,500 are studying to be teachers in one form or another, either undergraduate or postgraduate. And of course, someone like me, I've been in teacher education research as a research field for years, and also in kind of engaged with policy, and the policy aspects of it are kind of important, and that's why I'll dwell on it. And I'm going to talk about 3 areas of research that I've been involved in, or research and development. Quite a long-term project called the Political Economy of Teacher Education, PEAT was the acronym. Secondly, I'm going to talk about much more recently in the last 3 years, intervention studies we've done as Monash that I've led in education reform and teacher development in the Middle East, in really interesting contexts where there's profound social, economic, cultural, and indeed political change going on. And then finally, I'm going to come back to a critical analysis of education reform. This is another strand of what I do and what we do, and focus particularly on England as part of the United Kingdom, but England as a negative case study, a really interesting example, if you like, of what not to do. And what I'd like to highlight in the presentation is teacher education in our faculties. It's always had a really important role in the formation of nation states, as well as how these nation states change in social, cultural, and political economic terms, and they continue to do so. I think it's a really important awareness or recognition that we have. So what we do is not just about technically preparing people who can do certain things like plan lessons, teach lessons, and assess learning. It has always been much broader and much bigger than that. And when I refer to nation states, I'm really referring to 2 aspects of what we might call, if you like, a country. I'm referring to, first of all, the more cultural, collective sense of a nation, of who we are, as well as the state, which is much more to do with how populations and resources and so on are governed. And then finally, I'll come on to some implications for deans and faculties of education that I think go beyond what are traditionally our primary educational concerns and ideas. And these provide us with some opportunities, as well as things I think we need to be aware of and things that we need to recognize. So that's where I'll stop at the end of the talk and open it up to our respondents to discuss, to ask questions, and so on. So in the first strand of research, which is represented most recently in this book, The New Political Economy of Teacher Education, which I wrote with Lauren Gatti from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln, and Warwick Mansell, who is a really brilliant education journalist in the UK. And Warwick Mansell is probably the leading figure in England on school reform in terms of how schools are governed differently. And this book came out earlier this year, and you can actually read a free chapter if you look at my website, which I'll mention later. But in the book, what we do is we do a kind of historical, cultural, and political economic analysis of where teacher education's come from. And we situate it in context of colonization and post-colonization, as well as industrialization. And so we trace in the book the origins of teacher education in terms of its institutional practices in England, the USA, and Norway. We chose those countries because they represent different kinds of what are called welfare states, so different kinds of political economic arrangements that make provision to support citizens, to do with health, to do with education, to do with employment, to do with housing, and so on. So there is historical analysis of what we mean by a welfare state and how much the state, the government, provides to its citizens and for what reasons. And what we trace in England really is that in England, teacher education as an institutional practice that came along with the development of new colleges began at the end of the 18th century, around 1790, 1798, with the establishment of a teacher training college that was actually intended to produce teachers for the empire, the growing British Empire. And the notion of creating good British subjects, so in other words, to go to people who were indigenous in Australia and New Zealand, or more likely settlers, people who'd been moved to those countries or did move to those countries. And rather than allowing a kind of particular local national identity to flourish, you wanted to create English subjects or British subjects across the empire. And at the same time in England, you see industrialization. You know, sometimes England likes to see it as a cradle of the Industrial Revolution, but that changed society hugely. More people needed to be educated. But it was interesting that the impetus to prepare teachers came from this desire to educate people in the empire in far-flung places from England. And that was done on the basis of teacher education colleges and also textbooks. So you see a textbook industry emerging in England to try to standardize the message across the empire. In the USA, which is a post-European colonization society with a history of slavery, over the same period, you see increasingly racially segregated society developing, and a recognition within that society that they needed to prepare an education for Black people, for African American people, people who were the children of slaves and the legacy of slavery. And so you see particular forms of teacher education that we trace in the book that were distinct from, if you like, capital W, white European style teacher education, a form of industrial, as it was sometimes called, teacher education for Black people in the South, that gave them certain kinds of rights, but were also focused on shaping the Black population in certain ways as subordinate. And then in Norway, we trace the origins of teacher education shifting in two ways. Norway was a colony itself of Sweden, and the dominant language was Swedish, even though there was a local language that grew to become modern Norwegian. But you also see that society essentially being a very agriculturally based, a very communitarian society, where originally the teacher of younger children was really about someone who helped form them in a religious way. Teachers were very often the bell ringers in churches, and they did community work. And then as the country grew, and industrialization came late to Norway, so the process started later in Norway, the way they prepared teachers changed. And then what you trace to in Norway, is a particularly interesting example, is that Norway in the 1960s, with the help of the Americans, discovered it was sitting on massive oil and gas reserves. So in the 1960s into the 70s, Norway started to become incredibly rich with one of the highest GDPs per head of population in the world. And so they shifted and continued to shift their teacher education, if you like, to prepare people from a very different kind of economy, which was one where they needed a lot of STEM graduates who could work in the oil and gas industries. So in the book, we then talk about these challenges and issues that have been associated with the rise and development of teacher education, broader challenges to welfare states. So if you look at welfare states starting in different countries at different times, but late 19th century onwards into the early 20th century, really strengthened after the Second World War. By the time you get to the 1970s and economic crises, you start to get challenges to, can we really afford to do this? And that, of course, is a consistent theme to these days. And that's why you see differences in rationales for public spending on education, on schools, and on higher education. So, for example, it is still quite common in a country like Norway to see public spending on schools, spending on higher education, spending on better development of teachers in teacher education as an investment in nation building. So it's seen as a kind of part of a virtuous circle. The more we spend of taxpayers' money on this, the better will be education that we provide, the better that students will do, the more economically and innovative that they will be. We'll have a thriving economy and society. Whereas in other countries, you see a focus in times of austerity on efficiency, and you see policies sort of determined by economic rationality primarily. The other big challenge in relation to the welfare state critiques is about how individuals then become responsible for their own success. So then a policy response to that starts to become, okay, the role is to provide opportunities for people to succeed through their merit, and you provide the opportunities maybe such as scholarships for school students who perform well, who can go on to very good universities. And an alternative approach is you actually tackle structural inequalities, which are very often social and economic. So, for example, in China, you see a programmatic approach to revitalize education in rural communities. That is a very programmatic approach to tackling structural inequalities. You don't see that kind of work everywhere in the world. And the other thing that's become much more obvious to us recently is this essentially a move to deglobalize and the rise of populist nationalisms. And that's where you start to see a kind of suspicion of public bodies like universities in some countries, not all, in some countries. You see the growing, rather uncritical approval of non-state private actors. So in other words, you get this attraction to private sector solutions and corporate interventions and philanthropic interventions. And also in some countries, you see the rise of what's sometimes called executive power or strong state thinking, where the central government decide it knows best, even down to a level of fine detail. And I'll talk about that part in the third example I'll give you, but I'll move on to current work, which we're doing now, which are these intervention studies of education reform and teacher development in the Middle East. Fascinating area, not a region that I knew a lot about before I began here at Monash University in the current job. But it was a fortuitous collision of circumstances, and what I was able to do and what came to the university to do matched really well. And the work that we've been doing in two countries, working with two governments in the Middle East, is really in response to that question that I put at the top there. What happens when the base of your thriving economy changes suddenly at the same time that you're aware of changing political expectations by your population? So what that's about is essentially reshaping your regional Middle East political economy, but actually it's true in different countries across the world. And historically, that has happened, right? It's not a new phenomenon. So for example, Australia in the 1950s and the 60s was principally a kind of strong agricultural economy with some manufacturing. These days, Australia is much more to do with minerals, very successful, knowledge economy, universities, and so on. And what you see in the Middle East is a recognition that the world is either, depending on who you listen to, running out of oil and gas, or that it should stop using as much oil and natural gas. So in countries in the Middle East that have really benefited hugely from massive reserves, and they've been able to exert huge influence geopolitically because of their massively increased status and economic power. What do they do? And you will very often hear in the Middle East people using the phrase, the question, what will we do when the oil runs out? And so many of the countries in the Middle East have strategies that take them to a date, very often around 2030, when it's recognized that, okay, by then we have to have some different policies and different economic base in place for what has happened. So the shift for the Middle East is very much from oil and gas to, and then one part of that is clearly tourism, although as climate change makes the Middle East even hotter than it already is, and then it also throws in incredibly disruptive floods, as Dubai did have earlier this year. The other option is the knowledge economy, kind of economic, technological innovation. So the examples that I'm going to give you, we've been involved in, with one country improving career structures and planning professional development for teachers, for a whole population of teachers in one country. And then in another country, we've been introducing through R&D a new subject on the curriculum and new pedagogical approaches. And the new subject on the curriculum was drama, theatre, and the new pedagogical approaches were incorporating drama and theatre, role play, those kinds of things, more creative, more kind of interactive pedagogies in teaching. And both of those came about because the governments realized they needed to invest in their population and beyond their population, in fact, to create new kinds of economies, but also new kinds of societies in that region. And there are lots of really interesting confounding problems and risks that make this not only a really important region, I think, for us to work in teacher education, but also really, really fruitful area for research. So the confounding problems and risks for trying to do these things, of trying to create new structures for teachers as a profession and new teacher development opportunities, and having a subject like drama, that in the country we've been working in, drama hasn't been taught for 50 years. You know, in the country we've been working in, there was actually a prohibition for a long time on dance, drama, singing. These were things that were not approved by the version of Islam that that country had at that time. The confounding problems and risks here are demographics. So in some of the countries in the Middle East, the local population is very small. For example, in the United Arab Emirates, less than 25% of the population is Emirati. Around 75% of the population are expatriates, they're migrants, and they go there to do different kinds of work. So a very small local population trying to develop a rather large economy that's traditionally been based on oil and gas. You also have confounding problems to do with existing economic arrangements. Many of the countries in the region have what they might call a living allowance, what's sometimes called a universal basic wage. So people's basic housing and living costs are covered by the state, and they're more or less generous depending on which country you're in. And what that does then, both to the desire to work, but also the desire to complete an education program. So if there's no incentive for you to work, what's the incentive for you to complete the education program? Migration patterns. Most of these countries, even with small local populations, there's no pathway to citizenship for expatriates or migrants. They can have work visas, but they can never become citizens, and they can never get basic living allowances. Cultural norms, cultural norms, different versions of Islam, for example, from a more orthodox conservative form to a more liberal form. And in fact, a country like Saudi Arabia, which is traditionally associated with a conservative form, talks about a more liberal form of Islam. That's part of their programmatic approach as a government. So that's going on. The other part of the demographic, which I just forgot to mention, which is important here, is as well as local populations being small, they're very young. So more than 50% of the population of Saudi Arabia, for example, is under 25. Young people under 25 have very different expectations of what they can get from society and culture. And then finally, different traditions of government. So you might be interested, we might be expecting to work in contexts that are more or less democratic with parliaments and so on. But in some countries, in some regions of the world, you will find that it is essentially families, ruling families, govern countries, and they do so also with a kind of religious underpinning. These are all really interesting problems. They're really impactful areas for us to work in, both in terms of developing practice locally, understanding the impact we can have, but also in terms of research and the kinds of collaborations that you can have with other researchers, which I'll talk about at the kind of very end. And then the third and final area I'm going to talk about is critical policy analysis and looking at England as a negative case study. And so this is reflected in the book Teacher Education in Crisis, which is actually available free. It's an open access book that you can download from Bloomsbury Collections website. And the reason that I wanted to dwell on this is it's a really good example, I think, to the rest of the world. I wouldn't go as far as to say every part of the world, but certain parts of the world, of what not to do. So it's over a particular time period, 2019 to 2022, where in England you see a really radical acceleration of these post-1970s critiques of the welfare state. And that's happening at the same time as England is trying to deal with a COVID-19 pandemic. Now imagine putting those things together and everything being done on Zoom and all the state of anxiety that goes with both of those things. And what you see is what a political scientist called Poulantzas calls an authoritarian state, by which he didn't mean a government or a state that uses violence or force, physical violence or force necessarily, but the way that they govern. And if you combine that with a chaotic approach to government, such as Boris Johnson's prime ministership, which I think was kind of world-renowned, then you end up with some pretty interesting characteristic themes of policy reform in England. And the first of those, and again, I think this has relevance in many contexts around the world, not all, but many, you get a populist rhetoric, which is sort of intended to stir up suspicion of elites more generally, but universities too. And you get universities positioned as what's sometimes called strongholds of soft bigotry of low expectations. And that was actually a phrase that was first used in the US in the 1980s. And it was about how liberals can have very low expectations of people that they're seeking to promote and protect. And it was actually, that's been picked up in Australia by some Indigenous leaders too, to say, we need to expect more of us as Indigenous people. There's a guy called Noel Pearson who owns this view, but also the universities are not giving Indigenous people, they're not giving working class people, they're giving people from other socioeconomically disadvantaged backgrounds what they need to succeed. Yeah, hence the soft bit. And teacher educators very obviously presented as enemies of promise. So, though in England, with one education secretary, that was precisely the language. So there's a lot of rhetoric that is very interesting to study. And rhetoric has kind of, it's not just declarative stuff. It has an impact, it changes things. And then the second part is this kind of way of change, a way of doing change, which sometimes people call creative destruction. And I sometimes hear people use that phrase, creative destruction, very uncritically. And it comes from Marx, comes from, I think, the second volume of Capital. It was picked up by an Austrian economist called Joseph Schumpeter. And what it's intended to do is to signal a capitalist cycle of innovation and production, where you seek to destroy someone else's existing product that is profitable. So, for example, innovation produced, to go way back, CD-ROMs or DVDs that just obliterated the market for video cassettes. That's sometimes represented in a slogan, move fast and break things. That's I think is apocryphal as a motto of Google. But within technological innovations that might work and bring benefits to people, if you could give them something that works better and is cheaper. Creative destruction as an approach to education reform means you're destroying something that people are already moving through and in. And what are you left with after you do that? So England is a negative critical case. For example, as a result of these introductions, there are now even fewer teacher candidates in England. Fewer people wanted to be teachers, and more of them leave before they complete their teacher education program. So they don't even get into the classroom. They leave before they've finished their university course. And the challenges here, I think, are broader than just England. They're about expertise, both how we determine and how policymakers determine who experts are, what expertise is, how do you develop expertise. One kind of dominant approach to that has come from a certain version of psychology that says you just practice the same things over and over again, regardless, and you'll get better at it. I'm caricaturing things slightly there, but that gives you an idea of one view. Second challenge issue is evidence. What is it? I mean, evidence really has got to be something that persuades you to change or to act in a different way. So what relationship should we expect evidence to have with practice? And that is something I think is a very important question or questions to examine. And at Monash, we've had a fantastic project called the Q project, which was funded by the Paul Ramsay Foundation, which was designed entirely to address that question. The other challenge and issue is you have something we refer to in the first book as the enterprise narrative. Actually, Stephen Ball, the British sociologist, first coined that phrase. And that's about this sort of the allure of the charismatic social entrepreneur. They're very attractive figures in the teacher education reform landscape. They have a good story to tell. They are not bureaucratic. They're not bogged down by institutional constraints. They bring a kind of private sector energy that is very attractive to policymakers. Perhaps one of the best examples there is Wendy Kopp, who is the head of Teach for All, the umbrella organization for Teach for America, Teach First in the UK, Teach for China, and so on. Very, very powerful figure globally in teacher education, who positioned herself differently as a very charismatic, very appealing social entrepreneur. And the other challenges with this approach that England is taking is you develop what is essentially a shadow state. You end up with companies, charities, and sole traders that are less accountable to citizens and communities. They have no direct relationship to people at all. And that approach also excludes public bodies like universities that do have a social license. So if you look at surveys of people's perceptions of universities around the world, usually they have a pretty good sense that they are responsible, they act in responsible ways, they are trusted to an extent. And they have been under the kind of trajectory that I've outlined here that's taken hold in England, really very strongly excluded. So the implications that I will just finish now, this is my final slide. And this is where I've personally ended up as Dean now after 4.5 years. So I'm sharing that. You may all, if other deans are watching this, you may all have got there before me. But this is where I've got to. And bearing in mind my history, I was a teacher educator. So that's my background. I think that does frame some of the things we do and the questions we ask. But I'd like to end by saying, I think it's really important that teacher education as a field and as a form of work has a very strong awareness that you're working in a very complex social, political, economic, and cultural space. It's always been true, as I've tried to show. And I think that's why we need to have bigger conversations within faculties of education and outside about how we prepare teachers and why. And I think that is a question that is of direct interest to politicians, policymakers, the communities, generally other researchers, but we don't always engage with them on those terms. We very often think we are the experts in reflective practice or curriculum design or placements or technology mediated communication, whatever. We're not having those bigger, more complex conversations about where societies and economies are heading. The other thing I would say is that I think teacher education researchers, and I've been one for a long time, can, and I think this is an opportunity here, strongly situate what we do and develop what we do, strengthen what we do, with engagements with critical policy studies, which for teacher education research, there is a remarkably small literature. There's much more generally on schools, teachers, and leaders than there is on teacher education, but also political economy and what's sometimes called region studies. So those are people who might be geographers, they might be economists, they might be political scientists, they might be anthropologists, but people who focus on particular parts of the world. And I think there are huge opportunities for us to collaborate with political science and economics researchers, for example. And then finally, I think we need to position faculties of education different internally. And as I say, you might all have got there before me, but this is my kind of feeling at the moment. So within institutions and also externally. So I think a really important part of that, this is obviously at the lowest level, but actually at a very important framing level, I think we need to have stronger narratives about, as faculties of education, about our impact and capability broadly on society, culture, and the economy, as well as on schools and young people. It's not to say we're going to be experts on economics, but I think we do need to have strong stories to tell about what we do, how we engage, and what we can do. And I've certainly seen very promising signs of that repositioning within Monash. You know, if you're working with external governments in different parts of the world, that does get to the attention of vice chancellors. If they're high value projects, it does as well. But I think that process of making people aware of how important this activity is and how important it is to strengthen research in this area actually is a really important implication for us all. Thank you very much for listening. That's my email address if you'd like to contact me. And now I'll hand back to our respondents and the moderator.
Thanks, Professor Ellis, for bringing us such an informative and insightful talk. It covers many issues, such as the relation between teacher education and the nation state and the identity building. Also, the evolving role of the nation state and the challenges in today's teacher education. So to discuss this matter, I'd like to call on Jenny and Natalie. I'm sorry, could you mind give us some information of your research area? I'm got to introduce your research interest at the beginning. So when you join the dialogue, maybe you can give us more details about your research background. Jenny or... Yeah, Jenny first.
I hope you can hear me. I've just unmuted myself. I'm a postdoctoral fellow. You can see that I'm not young, even though this is called Young Scholars discussion. But I got into, or certainly did my PhD quite late. And that probably reflects on my principal area of interest, which is equity in education. And I certainly have an interest in, and I am a sociologist by background. So the things that Professor Ellis has touched on are really interesting to me and very relevant, I think, to the future of education. So I'm just thinking I might start with what you talked about. Well, it was really a flavour all the way through, but in the first part of your talk, what you laid out, Professor Ellis, is that universities are very much a product of their histories. They're a product of their current cultural ideologies, and that in some ways those things bind them. But you talked about innovative programs that might have been operating in the Middle East, but then very negative programs that have developed in the UK. So I guess my first question then is, what capability do you think we have as a society generally to be more than a product of our past, I guess? How do societies and universities particularly position themselves to respond to those challenges?
Thank you very much. I think that's a really important question. There's a Welsh cultural theorist called Raymond Williams, and the line is something like education. Well, the sociologists came to it later, but he did it first, which is education tends to reproduce things as they are, but always has the potential for transformation. And I think it's exploiting those opportunities. So we're inevitably, and as universities and as teacher education programs and as teacher educators, former teachers, we're framed by our past. But it is that bigger awareness, which I think is across multiple levels. So one is, I think, very often it's about looking up. You know, to say it metaphorically is because of our increasing specialization and encouraging to do that, we tend to look down and we tend to look at, with a kind of smaller and smaller kind of lens. But actually it's about there's a very important just awareness thing. So I think very often we get surprised in universities when politicians do things and we think it's somehow a attack on our autonomy. Well, first of all, I would say universities probably should only ever be relatively autonomous anyway. You know, nobody has a completely free rein to do exactly as they please, but it has obligations and responsibilities and ties. So I think there's something at the individual level around teacher education, and I think there's something for universities to do, which it is possible for universities to do. And one of the ways for getting institutions like our universities in Australia, in the UK, and maybe in North America, is to, if you like, appropriate the branding that they sometimes use. So, for example, Monash has a very popular, very successful brand line, which is called Change It. Okay. And it makes it very clear it wants to change the world. Now, there's a constant tension about how it publicizes that. I know there was one very famous case where I think they showed a video which was a marketing video, and there was a fight took place at a protest, and that very quickly got into the press, who said Monash University is encouraging people to fight. So I think you have to be careful of that, and universities are. But if you go for that kind of transformative intent, and you can take the opportunity to shift it beyond a presentation or a marketing device, there are opportunities there. And I think the other part of it is then you have to educate universities how complex this is. So you can't go to whatever country, region, or your own backyard and say, this is what you need to do. We know the best practices from wherever it happens to be this week: Finland, Singapore, Shanghai for mathematics teaching. Now you do it here in the eastern suburbs of Melbourne. Because that is also the tension that, you know, that's an expectation. Even very bright people who work in universities, in faculties of medicine, for example, with a different model of how you do research and what translation means. So all of which is to say, I think it is possible. I really do think it's possible. And I would be very honest with you and say I've come to it very late in life.
I'm glad to hear that, being someone who's already past the midpoint, I imagine, of my future career at university. Thank you for that. So just elaborating then on, I was really interested in what you talked about with what you call the enterprise narrative, which again came up in the UK critique. But I wasn't quite sure whether you were saying, is that a positive thing, or would you argue that that is also part of the way that citizens can be responsive and fight back against things such as what's happening in the UK?
So that's another really interesting question. So the enterprise narrative and the way that Ball used it and the way we're kind of using it is actually, it's intended to be used critically. So what we do is we look at the evidence for where very, very successful social entrepreneurs, education entrepreneurs. I think there's a new word that someone coined, maybe actually an Australian coined the word edupreneur, where you kind of you operate entrepreneur in education policy space. They have been hugely successful, and they have had a very important story to tell about, essentially, and this is where we do have to hold our hands up, I think, as universities in certain parts of the world. You know, universities and school systems have not, of their own volition, obviously changed things for the better of socioeconomically and otherwise disadvantaged populations. You know, so one of the complex and very interesting phenomena to study in the US is how privatization movements in terms of schools and teacher education has been taken forward by the African American community that have been historically appallingly badly served by the American school system. But they have come up with new ways of educating their the population of African American kids in what are usually very poor parts of major cities. And they've got good reason for being involved. They've got good, but those people, I would say, are slightly distinct from the people that we are specifically referring to, who are usually people who are much more, well, for example, they are usually white, and they usually think they know what's best for other groups, and they tell a very powerful story which connects to data and evidence about differential rates of school completion, underachievement, and so on. And they do a really good job at telling the story and having a very strong narrative. But when you examine the evidence is really not consistently strong. There are some little flickers, you know, as you'd expect, but there's no direct evidence that says that the outcomes of the enterprise narrative have been any more successful in delivering better opportunities for all students or all teachers. So that's the way that we're kind of intending it. The other term we use in the book is the shadow state. And that, I think, connects to your question too, because the shadow state came from a geographer called Jennifer Walsh in the 1980s. And what she was referring to were organizations that were essentially community organizations and charities that knew the needs of particular groups really well. So housing, for example, you know, homeless people. Who knows a lot about homelessness? Homeless people do. And so charities that were led by involving homeless people could be very effective, the argument went, at delivering services that usually were done by the state. So Jennifer Walsh coined this term, studying in the late 80s, the shadow state, where the state says, okay, you can do that better. We're going to offload it, and you are going to deliver these services because you know more about it than the state does. So that was actually, in again, quite positive sense. But what she then worked through over the next few years when she followed them through, and then we've picked up in the book, is there then becomes an increasingly strong disconnect between the people and the communities the service is intended for and the provider. And the strongest relationship is between the provider and the state. And there's no kind of check on that in terms of accountability or in democratic contexts, democratic accountability. So the shadow state is an interesting one because it came from, if you like, a well-intentioned place, and giving space to people who are able to do things differently and positively disrupt reproduction of the status quo. But then they've become much more mechanisms in the first book, The New Political Economy of Teacher Education, of just delivering what the state wants in terms of the reform much more efficiently, because you eliminate these difficult organizations like universities that want to deliberate it, talk about it, write papers about it, and so on. And if you fund those shadow state organizations very, very parsimoniously, you keep them hungry. And they've got very often no other sources of income. And so you're able to get a lot of leverage over the organization to get them to do what you want.
Unmute myself again. I might, Nat, do you want to start your questions? I don't want to hold the, I've got another question, but I can come in at the end if there's enough time.
Yep, no worries. Thank you, Jenny. So firstly, thank you, Professor Ellis, for sharing your insights with us. You've certainly given me a lot to think about as a future teacher educator and in the context of my own PhD studies as well. So my name's Natalie. I have a background in rural education research and university research management, and I'm currently studying my PhD, which focuses on the role of rural education research and how it gets used to inform education policy. So I have a couple of questions too, and I'll just sort of, my first one relates a bit to your response to Jenny's question. So I'll start with that one. So the idea, you talk about the idea of teacher education always operating in social political environments. I'm just wondering how, as deans of faculties and education, how you can support teacher educators to prepare teachers who will work in communities with very vulnerable students, because often in policy that is responsive to these kinds of environments and so tightly controlled, it's usually our most vulnerable students that aren't represented in policy, whether that's rural students, students from disadvantaged, low socioeconomic backgrounds, migrants, refugees, etc.
Okay, I think I'm going to come back at that one in a very broad sense. So, and kind of talk about the premise of the question a bit too. So I think that if you know that notion of the vulnerable student, and at risk is often a phrase people use in different contexts around the world too. They are there in many countries. But to go back to the previous answer I gave, very often the policy makes an assumption that they know what the answer is, but actually they don't necessarily understand the problem or the challenge, such as it is. So I would say that in some countries, I'm not talking about all, but in the countries I've worked in, you sometimes see very bad policies because they're framed in ways that, if you like, position rural students or regional students or students with disabilities in deficit ways. And there's a presumption that what they need is what has made the kind of typical white middle class in Australia and England student successful. And that's really strong in England because they've even taken Bourdieu's concept of cultural capital and they've wrecked it. And they use it to say, you need to give these kids their cultural capital. So I think it's a really interesting kind of phenomenon. And it also assumes that there are, the problem for me is not so much that they're invisible or they're absent, it's the way they're positioned. And then various assumptions like, it's a quick fix. If only teachers did X, Y, and Z. And very often the quick fix involves very limited interpretations of cognitive science around memory, or that you assume that your educational reform, your teacher education reform, will, quote, solve the problem, when the problem is housing, access to health, access to jobs, access to childcare, and so on. And those for me are the problems around the way sometimes people frame education reform for any particular group they think is marginalized, vulnerable, or at risk.
Thanks so much. I 100% agree that that's often the framing of the problem that creates the problem itself. So, my second question does relate to your example of England, but also potentially teacher education in many places around the world, because it's becoming more and more tightly regulated and controlled. I'm just wondering how you see the future role of teacher education academics in all of this, because both in terms of the research that they do about teacher education, but also in terms of actually delivering initial teacher education courses, because if there's so little scope for, using the example of England, to actually create courses based on academic research and evidence, is it possible that teacher educators could, for example, just be replaced by someone who is trained to present pre-prepared materials by someone who has created the course based on what they think is needed in the policy environment?
Yes. That's yeah, it's look, it's really bad there at the moment. I mean, I've got another project with a guy called Ian Cushing from Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK, and it's funded by the British Academy, which is like a Scott, like what would the word equivalent be in Australia? I don't know, but it would be it's like a research council organization, scholarly organization, so on. And it's studying now what's going on. And I was talking to someone from a very elite university in England last night that has had to really fundamentally shift their absolutely brilliant course. I know it's really good. I don't know it from as a student, but I can see it looks really, they've had to change it to comply with what the state thinks they should do, even to the level of what should be on their PowerPoint slides. And this is a really elite university that's got a fantastic track record in doing what it does really, really well. I think the problem will be if places like that, it doesn't work. And I don't think it will work, because the evidence we've seen so far from the pilots is more students leave the course than they used to. There will be a big political problem then in England, which will be you've lost your major universities from preparing teachers, and that will look bad for politicians. It'll look really, really bad. And whilst they may like to have lots of private providers, jumping in and disrupting things, they can't operate at the scale that universities can. And it would need a much bigger injection of cash and resources and everything else to make it kind of work. So I think what's going on in England is really, really worth studying as it evolves. It's not going to go well. It's not going to be one of those things where, as happened in, to use another example, in England 20 years ago with the London school system and an intervention called London Challenge, which really helped London schools and really helped outcomes for all students in London. And that's been studied by a wide range of people for a long time, and the evidence is very positive about it. I think this is going to be a real disaster that's unfolding in real time, and it's really worth people studying. I feel like a bit of a traitor saying that. I am British, as you might guess, with my accent. But I think it is really important that people look at what's going on in England, and look at some really interesting examples elsewhere in the world too of what can be done positively. And Norway, I think, is an interesting example. They probably try to do too much. They probably try to reform and change too often, so nothing ever really has a chance to develop. But it's much more kind of interesting and thoughtful, Norway. And what I've said in terms of structural reform in China is also really interesting to look at what's happening in China. So yeah, that's my answer there.
Thank you so much for that.
Natalie, do you have more questions?
I might hand back to Jenny, who said she had a third question there. because I know we're getting close to time.
Thank you. And this is really, I suppose, a very open-ended question. But you've elaborated, Professor Ellis, on the various ways that political agendas can affect initial teacher education policy, and you've talked about that in your books as well. But you also mentioned, and we haven't alluded to this, you also used the phrase at one stage, can we really afford to do this? That there's always that, I guess, broader implication that if societies can no longer afford to do things, they tend not to do them well. Can you just elaborate a bit on the broader implications that you think that has for the future and the nature of education into the future?
Yeah, okay. That's a nice big one.
Yes.
I thought you were going to ask me what I would like for lunch. So it is a really, there are very stark examples around the world of different approaches which manage to combine that notion. Sometimes it's called the Nordic model, and I don't think there is really a Nordic model because Sweden's very different now, Denmark is very different now, Finland is changing, Norway's a bit sort of, but Norway's unusual because it's rich, very, very rich. But across those countries, there's still a kind of sense that yes, and it is an economic point, you spend, you know, it's a mind shift. You're not spending to provide people, quote, with a safety net. You're not giving resources to schools to kind of make children compliant citizens, or you're not giving people unemployment benefit just to give them a helping hand. The mind shift is state investment is nation building. That's I used to work in Norway and I always used to complain about the taxes. They're really high. And ordinary people would just say to me, that's how we build a nation. Literally, that's the phrase they would use. It's part of building our country. And I think it's that sense of, and it's not it is an economic point, not just a social policy point. Their argument that if you invest in social infrastructure, if you invest in what called the welfare state and other aspects of social infrastructure, that can actually lead to economic innovation, and that then strengthens the economy. So sometimes that's called the virtuous circle of the Nordic economies. And to a degree, it is true in Norway. But I think it is that mind shift. You're not calibrating public spending, how much you can get away with pension payments for people before part of your population complains. You're actually taking a whole kind of country, whole nation, whole state approach, and you're thinking of it as investment.
Thank you.
Okay, Professor Ellis, I noticed there is a question in the dialog box asked by Winter. Winter, are you here? Would you mind to clarify your questions? Her question is how to cope with frequent hot waves, floods, and extremely cold temperatures upsetting school students. Maybe I'm not sure Winter is here. So Professor Ellis, would you mind give some feedback?
Okay, so I think that question for me is pointing to a broader issue about education systems preparing people for a more sustainable future. And we absolutely know that's really important.
Yeah, thank you. The time has gone away from us. So for our audience, if you want to know more about the topic, you can read Professor Ellis' 2 books. One is The New Political Economy of Teacher Education. The other is Teacher Education in Crisis. If you are interested in our guest's research area, you are welcome to email them to continue the dialogue. So I have to close the dialogue, and I'd like to appreciate your time, your involvement, and your wisdom. Wish you have a nice day. And for a short conclusion, I'm strongly agree with Professor Ellis' point. The teacher education is a complex social, cultural, and political space. It needs more collective action and more dialogue. Maybe today's dialogue is a good start.
Thank you very much. And thank you to Jenny and
Thank
Natalie.
you so much.